Hello there. Welcome to another soothing night of historical reality checks. Tonight, we're travelling back to a time that's often romanticised in movies and books, but was actually a nightmare of disease, danger and, well, death. The Dark Ages, where you probably wouldn't survive 24 hours. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, and let your mind drift back to a time when comfort didn't exist. Before we begin our journey through medieval misery, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if these historical bedtime stories help you drift off. Now, dim your lights, take a deep breath, and prepare to be grateful for modern plumbing, medicine and, well, everything else. Imagine this. You've just opened your eyes in a small village somewhere in the 14th century Europe. Congratulations, you're alive, for now. The first thing that hits you isn't the morning light streaming through your window, because there is no window. It's the smell. A powerful cocktail of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and smoke that permeates everything. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of straw covered with a rough woolen blanket that hasn't been washed in, possibly ever. The wool still contains oils from the sheep it came from, making it somewhat water resistant, but also pungent. Your mattress is alive, with fleas, lice, bedbugs, and possibly mice that have made homes in the straw beneath you. You're not alone in this bed, not by a long shot. Your entire family, parents, siblings, maybe grandparents, all piled together for warmth. Personal space? That concept won't be invented for several hundred years. The children's feet are in your face. Someone's elbow is lodged firmly in your ribs, and something wet just touched your leg that you'd rather not investigate. The distant sound of church bells serves as your alarm clock. It's barely dawn, but in medieval times you rise with the sun and work until it sets. Sleeping in isn't an option when your survival depends on your labour, every single day. Your one-room home is a masterpiece of multifunctional living. This single space serves as bedroom, kitchen, living room, and during the winter, barnyard. Yes, your chickens, goat or pig might be sharing your living space when it's cold. Medieval housing developers really embraced the open concept floor plan. About 1,000 years before HGTV made it trendy, the floor beneath your feet is packed dirt, cold, often damp, and impossible to truly clean. On the plus side, you don't have to worry about spills ruining the carpet. You stretch your aching body. At 25 years old, you're already approaching middle age by medieval standards. Your joints creak, your back aches, and that tooth that's been bothering you for months continues to throb with a dull, persistent pain. There's no dentist to call, no ibuprofen to take, just a persistent companion of physical discomfort that medieval people accepted as normal. And now, nature calls. When it comes to relieving yourself in the 14th century, you have options, all of them terrible. If you're a peasant living in the countryside, you might wander outside to a designated area behind your house. If you're in a town, you might have a chamber pot, essentially a ceramic bucket that sits in the corner of your one-room home. Privacy during this most personal moment? Absolutely not. After you've done your business, what happens next would horrify any modern health inspector. In towns and cities, the contents of chamber pots were often simply tossed out the window into the street below. The prudent medieval citizen would shout, "Gardez-l'eau," a warning derived from the French "garde l'eau," or "watch out for the water," before dumping. Though honestly, by the time you heard the warning, it was usually too late. The streets of medieval towns were essentially open sewers. Channels of filth running down the middle where everything from human waste to animal droppings to household garbage accumulated. The smell was beyond description. During rainstorms, these channels would overflow, creating a toxic soup that seeped into basements and ground floors. In some larger towns, public latrines existed, essentially wooden benches with holes positioned over rivers or cesspits. These were communal experiences where people would sit side by side, chatting casually while handling their personal business. Social distancing was not a medieval concept. Toilet paper? Please. That luxurious invention was centuries away. Instead, you might use leaves, moss, a handful of straw, or if you were wealthy, perhaps wool or hemp. The Romans had used a sponge on a stick, kept in a bucket of vinegar or salt water between uses, and shared by everyone. By medieval times, this sophisticated technology had been largely forgotten. Hand washing afterwards, an inconsistent practice at best. Germ theory wouldn't exist for hundreds of years. Making every meal preparation, every childbirth, every wound treatment an invitation for infection. You're hungry now. But breakfast as we know it didn't really exist for most medieval people. The word breakfast literally means breaking your fast from the night before. But many medieval people, especially the poorer classes, only ate 1 or 2 meals a day. If you were fortunate enough to eat something in the morning, it would be simple and quick. Perhaps a piece of bread left over from yesterday, maybe dipped in ale. Yes, ale for breakfast. Water was often unsafe to drink, contaminated with the same waste that filled the streets. Beer and ale, having been boiled during the brewing process, were often safer options, even for children. The alcohol content was lower than modern beer, but still, you're starting your day with alcohol because it's the safe choice. The bread itself would barely resemble what we call bread today. It would be dark, dense, and often containing bits of dirt, insects, or sawdust mixed in with the flour. The grain might be partially spoiled or contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, gangrene, and death. Medieval bakers weren't being malicious. They just worked with what they had, and what they had was often of questionable quality. If you were wealthier, you might have some salted meat or perhaps cheese with your bread. Fresh fruit or vegetables, those were seasonal luxuries, not daily staples. The modern concept of balanced nutrition was unknown, and vitamin deficiencies were rampant. And now, properly nourished with your ale-soaked bread, it's time to begin your workday. Unless you were born into nobility, which statistically you almost certainly weren't, your workday would involve physical labour from dawn until dusk. Approximately 85% of the medieval population were serfs tied to the land, essentially working as farmers with very limited freedom. For men, this might mean ploughing fields with crude wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, if your village was fortunate enough to have them. Otherwise, you might be pulling that plough yourself. You'd plant crops, build fences, repair tools, cut wood, and tend to livestock, all without mechanized equipment. Every task required manual strength, endurance, and technical skill passed down through generations. Women's work was equally demanding, but often more varied. Beyond helping in the fields during planting and harvest times, women were responsible for maintaining the household. Cooking, brewing ale, spinning wool, weaving cloth, making clothes, preserving food, collecting firewood, fetching water, and raising children. Medieval women didn't have the luxury of focusing on just one career. They were simultaneously farmers, brewers, bakers, childcare providers, textile workers, and more. If you lived in a town, rather than the countryside, you might be an apprentice or journeyman in a craft guild. This could mean working as a blacksmith, carpenter, tanner, baker, or any number of specialised trades. These jobs came with their own hazards. Blacksmiths risked burns and eye injuries. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals that turned their skin leathery and reduced their lifespan significantly, and bakers often developed respiratory problems from constantly inhaling flour dust. Child labour wasn't just common, it was expected. Children as young as 7 would be working alongside adults, learning trades or helping in the fields. There was no concept of childhood as a protected time for play and education as we understand it today. Your workday would be governed by daylight rather than hours. In summer, this could mean 16-hour workdays. In winter, the workday was shorter, but so were the supplies of food and firewood. Speaking of which, let's talk about the weather. Today, we check weather apps and adjust our plans accordingly. In medieval times, you were at the complete mercy of weather patterns you couldn't predict or understand. A late frost could kill crops and lead to starvation. Too much rain could cause flooding and disease. Not enough rain meant drought and, yes, starvation again. Your clothing offered minimal protection against the elements. Peasants typically wore simple garments made of wool or linen, scratchy, uncomfortable, and rarely changed or washed. Undergarments as we know them didn't exist for most people. In winter, you'd layer what little clothing you had and stay close to the fire, if you could afford to keep one burning. Your home provided little insulation from extreme temperatures. In winter, the one-room dwelling would be sealed up as much as possible to retain heat from the central hearth, meaning you lived in a smoky, oxygen-depleted environment for months. Smoke-related respiratory diseases were common, as was carbon monoxide poisoning. In summer, the same home could become stifling, with no fans, air conditioning, or even screens to keep out insects. Windows, if they existed at all, would be small openings covered with oiled paper or thin animal hide rather than glass. Wetness was a particular enemy in medieval life. Once your clothes or bedding got wet, they could remain damp for days or weeks in cool, humid weather. This constant dampness contributed to pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various fungal infections that could be deadly without treatment. Weather didn't just affect your comfort, it determined whether you lived or died. A single bad harvest due to weather could wipe out entire villages through the resulting famine. The infamous famine of 1315 to 1317 resulted from years of heavy rainfall that drowned crops across Europe. People resorted to eating bark, rats, and, according to some accounts, even other people. And if the weather itself didn't kill you, perhaps disease would. In the 21st century, we worry about catching a cold or the flu. In medieval times, a simple cut could lead to death from infection. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another 600 years, leaving medieval physicians with herbs, prayer, and often dangerous treatments like bloodletting. Let's start with the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia in the 14th century. Transmitted by fleas carried by rats, the plague killed approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Symptoms included painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes, fever, vomiting blood, and black spots on the skin from internal bleeding. Death typically came within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms, but the plague was just one of many deadly threats. Smallpox left survivors permanently scarred if they were lucky enough to survive. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, caused victims to waste away slowly, coughing up blood as their lungs deteriorated. Leprosy led to progressive disfigurement and social isolation in specialized colonies. Dysentery, colloquially known as the bloody flux, was rampant due to contaminated water supplies. The resulting dehydration from severe diarrhea could kill within days, especially children and the elderly. Children faced additional threats from measles, whooping cough, and diphtheria. diseases we now routinely vaccinate against. Medieval parents expected to lose multiple children. Infant mortality rates ranged from 30% to 50%. Wounds that we'd treat with antiseptic and bandages could quickly become gangrenous in the Middle Ages, often requiring amputation. Performed without anaesthesia, using saws and knives that weren't sterilised between patients. Dental problems were particularly nightmarish. Cavities were treated by drilling into teeth with hand-powered drills or simply pulling them out without painkillers. Many people lived with chronic dental pain or dangerous abscesses that could spread infection to the brain. Parasitic infections were nearly universal. Intestinal worms, lice, and other parasites were constant companions for almost everyone, regardless of social status. A medieval person's body wasn't just their own. It was a habitat for countless unwelcome organisms. Treatment options were limited and often counterproductive. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to result from an imbalance of these humours, leading to treatments like bloodletting that actually weakened already vulnerable patients. Medical practitioners ranged from university-trained physicians who served the wealthy to local wise women with knowledge of herbal remedies. Surgery was performed by barbers, whose experience with sharp implements made them the default choice for procedures like amputations, tooth extractions, and bloodletting. Perhaps worst of all was that the true causes of disease remained unknown. Illness might be attributed to sin, bad air, planetary alignments, or divine punishment, but never to microscopic organisms or contaminated water supplies. This meant that preventative measures were virtually non-existent or focused on the wrong things entirely. And if disease didn't claim you, perhaps violence would. Medieval justice bore little resemblance to our modern legal system. There were no police forces as we know them today. Instead, most communities relied on a hue and cry system. If you witnessed a crime, you were obligated to shout and raise alarm, and all able-bodied men were required to join in pursuit of the criminal. The law itself was harsh and unevenly applied. Theft was punishable by death if the stolen item was valued above a certain amount. Even minor crimes could result in mutilation, cutting off ears, hands, or feet as both punishment and warning to others. For those awaiting trial, there was no presumption of innocence. Proof of guilt might be established through trial by ordeal, walking on hot coals, plunging your hand into boiling water, or being bound and thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent, though possibly drowned. If you floated, you were guilty and subsequently executed. The logic was that water, being pure, would reject the guilty. Public executions were community events, sometimes drawing thousands of spectators. Hanging was common for ordinary criminals, while nobles might receive the supposedly more dignified death by beheading. Particularly serious crimes like treason or heresy could result in being burned alive, drawn and quartered, or broken on the wheel. Methods designed to maximize suffering and serve as deterrents. Beyond official punishments, interpersonal violence was simply more common and accepted. Disputes that might be settled with words today would escalate to physical confrontations. Tavern arguments regularly ended in stabbings. Domestic violence was considered a husband's right rather than a crime. Murder rates in medieval England were estimated to be 10 to 20 times higher than in modern times. Homicide was so common that most killers were never caught or punished unless the victim was wealthy or powerful. Speaking of wealth and power, let's talk about the social hierarchy that determined every aspect of your medieval life. Forget social mobility. In medieval society, you were born into your social class and would almost certainly die in it. The feudal system was a rigid hierarchy with the monarch at the top, followed by nobles, knights, clergy, and finally, the vast majority of the population, peasants and serfs. If you were born a serf, as approximately 85% of the population was, you were legally bound to the land you worked on. You couldn't leave, change occupations, marry, or make major life decisions without your lord's permission. You were not technically a slave, but the distinction would have felt academic at best. Serfs typically gave 10% of their harvest to the church as a tithe, and anywhere from 30% to 50% to their lord. What remained was barely enough to survive on, leaving no margin for error when crops failed or winters were harsh. The nobility, by contrast, lived in relative comfort, though even their lives would seem incredibly difficult by modern standards. Stone castles were cold, draughty, and dark. Privacy was limited even for the wealthy, with servants constantly present and family members sharing sleeping quarters. The clergy offered one of the few paths for social advancement, particularly for younger sons of noble families who wouldn't inherit land. Monasteries and convents provided education and relative security, though at the cost of personal freedom. For women, options were even more limited. Noble women were essentially political and reproductive assets, with marriages arranged to forge alliances, rather than for love or compatibility. Peasant women worked just as hard as men in the fields, while also bearing and raising children, maintaining households, and performing specialised work like brewing and textile production. This rigid hierarchy was justified by the Great Chain of Being, a religious concept that portrayed social stratification as divinely ordained. Kings ruled by divine right, nobles were born to their privilege, and peasants were meant to serve. Questioning this arrangement wasn't just socially unacceptable, it could be considered heresy. And speaking of heresy, let's talk about the medieval church and its all-encompassing power. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the framework through which people understood the world, judged behaviour, and organised their lives. Church authority extended far beyond spiritual matters into politics, economics, education, and daily life. The church calendar determined when you worked and when you rested, with numerous saints' days and religious festivals punctuating the year. The church dictated what you could eat and when, forbidding meat on Fridays and during Lent, for example. Marriage, birth, and death all fell under church jurisdiction. Religious observance wasn't optional. Missing Sunday Mass could result in public penance or fines. Refusing to participate in religious life altogether could lead to accusations of heresy, a crime punishable by torture and execution. The concept of personal salvation dominated medieval thinking. Hell was described in vivid, terrifying detail from pulpits across Europe, and the average person lived in genuine fear of eternal damnation. This fear was exploited through practices like the selling of indulgences, essentially paying the church to reduce one's time in purgatory. Questioning church doctrine or authority could be dangerous. The Inquisition actively sought out heretics, using torture to extract confessions and burning those found guilty at the stake. Even reading the Bible in your native language rather than Latin could be considered heretical in some periods. For all this harshness, the church also provided essential services. Monasteries preserved knowledge through their libraries and scriptoria, provided medical care, however limited by modern standards, and offered charity to the poor. In a world without social safety nets, church almshouses and hospitals were often the only resources available to the destitute. But even with the promise of heaven awaiting the faithful, medieval life was brutally short. If you were born in medieval Europe and survived infancy, which approximately 30% of children did not, your life expectancy would be shockingly brief by modern standards. The average medieval person who reached adulthood might live to about 35 to 40 years, though these statistics are somewhat skewed by high infant and child mortality. While it wasn't unheard of for people to live into their 60s or even 70s, Such longevity was rare and considered remarkable. A medieval person who reached 50 was considered elderly, their body likely worn down by decades of physical labour, multiple pregnancies for women, poor nutrition, and untreated chronic conditions. The stages of life were accelerated accordingly. Children began working alongside adults by age 7. Girls could be married as young as 12, boys at 14. Though peasant marriages often occurred later when couples could establish independent households, by 15 or 16 you would be considered a full adult with all associated responsibilities. For women, childbirth represented a particularly dangerous milestone. Complications that would be routinely managed today were often fatal. Approximately 1 to 2% of births ended in maternal death, a figure that accumulated dangerously over multiple pregnancies. A woman who had 8 children, not unusual for the era, faced a roughly 10 to 15% cumulative risk of dying in childbirth. Age brought little security or respect. Without retirement plans or pensions, the elderly depended entirely on their families for support. Those without family might end their days as beggars if they couldn't find shelter in a church almshouse. Physical aging was accelerated by hard labour and poor nutrition. Dental problems were universal. Many people lost most or all of their teeth by middle age. Arthritis and other degenerative conditions made continued work increasingly painful, but rarely exempted anyone from daily labour. Eyesight problems couldn't be corrected with glasses for most people, making detailed work increasingly difficult with age. Death, when it came, was far more visible and integrated into daily life than in our modern society. People typically died at home, with bodies prepared for burial by family members rather than professional funeral directors. Cemeteries were often located in town centres around churches, keeping the dead literally in the midst of the living community. Let's spend some time discussing what medieval people actually ate, and how it differed dramatically based on social class. Food in the Middle Ages was less about pleasure and more about survival, particularly for the lower classes. For peasants, the daily diet centred around a concept that would seem monotonous to us: the one-pot meal. This typically meant pottage, a fixed stew made from whatever was available, simmered in a cauldron that hung permanently over the hearth. Into this pot went grains, usually barley, rye, or oats rather than wheat, vegetables in season, occasionally meat scraps or bones for flavour, and herbs. The same pot might be kept simmering for days or weeks, with new ingredients added as needed. Bread was the other dietary staple, though peasant bread bore little resemblance to our modern loaves. Dark, dense, and often containing debris from the milling process, this bread provided necessary calories, but was hard on the teeth and digestive system. White bread made from refined wheat flour was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Protein came primarily from legumes like peas and beans, rather than meat for most common people. When meat was available, every part of the animal was used. Organs, blood, brains, feet, and other parts we might discard today were essential components of medieval cooking. Nothing could be wasted when food scarcity was a constant threat. Dairy products like cheese and butter were important sources of fat and protein, though without refrigeration, these had to be consumed relatively quickly or preserved through salting or smoking. Fruits and vegetables were strictly seasonal and often smaller and less sweet than their modern counterparts. Wild foraged foods supplemented garden produce. Mushrooms, berries, nuts, and wild greens provided vital nutrients when available. For the wealthy, food was an entirely different experience. Noble tables might groan under elaborate preparations of meat, multiple species served at a single meal, often reconstituted into their living forms for presentation. A roasted peacock might be redressed in its feathers, a pig made to appear as if still walking. Spices were status symbols as much as flavourings. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were incredibly expensive, imported over vast distances, and used lavishly by those who could afford them to demonstrate wealth. Sugar, too, was a luxury item, used both as a spice in savoury dishes and as the basis for elaborate confectionery creations at wealthy tables. These early desserts often combined sugar with ground almonds and rose water into confections shaped like animals, castles, or other fanciful forms. Both rich and poor were subject to the church's dietary restrictions, which prohibited meat on Fridays, during Lent, and on numerous other fast days throughout the year. Fish was permitted on these days, creating a robust trade in preserved fish, particularly herring and cod. Seasonal food shortages were expected and planned for, but extended famines were catastrophic. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe after several years of cold, wet weather destroyed crops. Desperate people resorted to eating bark, rats, and shoe leather. Historical accounts describe parents abandoning children they couldn't feed, and even occasional cannibalism in the most extreme circumstances. Of course, all this food needed to be washed down with something, which brings us to medieval beverages. One of the most surprising aspects of medieval life for modern people is that water was often the beverage of last resort. This wasn't due to preference, but necessity. Water sources were frequently contaminated with human and animal waste, making waterborne diseases like dysentery a constant threat. Instead, most people drank ale or beer with practically every meal, including breakfast. Medieval ale was lower in alcohol than modern beer, cloudy with suspended yeasts and grains, and often flavoured with herbs rather than hops. Women were the primary brewers in most households, producing enough for family consumption, and sometimes selling excess to neighbours. Wine was common in regions where grapes grew easily, such as southern Europe. Elsewhere, it was primarily consumed by the wealthy or reserved for special occasions and religious ceremonies. Medieval wine would barely be recognisable to modern wine enthusiasts. It was often sweetened with honey, spiced heavily, and consumed relatively young rather than aged. For the very poor, or during times of shortage, small beer, with minimal alcohol content, might be the only option. Children typically drank watered-down ale, or small beer rather than water, making the modern concept of childhood sobriety a relatively recent development. Milk was rarely consumed as a beverage by adults, being reserved primarily for the very young or elderly. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled quickly and was more valuable transformed into butter or cheese for preservation. Hot beverages like tea and coffee were unknown in medieval Europe, though herbal infusions were used medicinally. The morning ritual of coffee or tea to start the day would have seemed completely foreign to medieval people. Now, let's turn our attention to another critical aspect of medieval life: clothing and personal hygiene, or the lack thereof. The mythology of brave knights in shining armour and ladies in flowing gowns obscures the reality of the medieval clothing, which was functional, uncomfortable, and rarely changed. For peasants, clothing was homespun, typically made from wool or linen depending on climate and availability. Undergarments as we know them didn't exist for most people. A basic linen shift or tunic would be worn next to the skin, with additional layers added as needed for warmth or protection. These garments weren't regularly washed. The process of removing, washing and drying clothes was too labour-intensive for frequent changes. Instead, the linen undergarment absorbed body oils and sweat and was occasionally aired out. Colours were muted natural tones for common people, as bright dyes were expensive and often reserved for the wealthy by sumptuary laws that regulated clothing based on social class. Vibrant reds, purples, and blues signalled wealth and status. Shoes, when available, were simple leather affairs that conformed to the foot with wear rather than providing support. Many peasants went barefoot in warmer months to preserve their shoes for winter, resulting in feet that were calloused, cracked, and often infected. Personal hygiene practices would shock modern sensibilities. Full body bathing was rare, particularly in northern Europe, where the cold made it impractical, and contemporary medical theory suggested that opening the pores through bathing could allow disease to enter the body. Instead, people might wash hands and face regularly while reserving full bathing for special occasions like marriages or seasonal celebrations. Without modern deodorants, toothpaste, or frequent clothing changes, the smell of the medieval world would be overwhelming to contemporary noses. Body odour, smoke from cooking fires, animal manure, human waste, and rotting garbage created an olfactory landscape that we can scarcely imagine today. Teeth were cleaned, when they were cleaned at all, with cloth, twigs, or fingers rubbed with abrasive substances like salt or charcoal. Tooth decay was universal, leading to chronic pain, abscesses, and early tooth loss. Head and body lice were so common they were barely remarked upon, affecting people of all social classes. Even nobility, with their elaborate hairstyles and headdresses, contended with parasites. Various herbal remedies and mercury-based treatments were employed against lice, often causing more harm than good. For women, menstruation presented additional hygiene challenges. Cloth rags were used and reused, washed when possible, in an era before modern sanitary products. This contributed to reproductive tract infections that could lead to infertility or death. Now, let's imagine you've somehow survived all these challenges and hazards of daily life. What would you do for entertainment in the medieval world? Life in the Middle Ages was undeniably harsh, but humans have always found ways to create joy and diversion, even in difficult circumstances. Entertainment in medieval times was largely communal, centered around religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, and life milestones. Village festivals punctuated the agricultural year, providing rare opportunities for relaxation and community bonding. May Day celebrated spring with dancing around maypoles, while harvest festivals featured feasting and drinking from the new season's ale or wine. These occasions might include simple games, music played on instruments like pipes, drums, or string instruments, and dancing. Storytelling was a valued skill in communities where literacy was rare. Professional travelling entertainers, minstrels, jongleurs, and troubadours brought news, music, and tales from distant places. These performers might also display trained animals, acrobatic feats, or juggling. For those who could afford to watch or participate, tournaments provided exciting spectacle. Though we often imagine knights in shining armour competing for a lady's favour, early tournaments were brutal, dangerous affairs more resembling small battles than sporting events. Later tournaments became more stylised and less lethal, but remained primarily entertainments for the nobility. Board games provided indoor diversion. Chess was known, but primarily played by the educated elite. More common people might play tables, an early form of backgammon, or nine men's Morris, games with simple equipment that could be easily made. Gambling was widespread despite periodic attempts by authorities to control it. Dice games were particularly popular and required minimal equipment, making them accessible across social classes. Cards began appearing in Europe in the late medieval period, quickly becoming popular for both gambling and entertainment. Children's games reflected adult occupations and social structures, mock battles for boys, household management for girls. Though children had far less time for play than in our modern world, being integrated into the workforce from an early age. Religious drama formed another important entertainment category. Mystery plays depicting biblical stories were performed in town squares or churchyards, often on wagons that moved between locations. These performances combined religious instruction with entertainment, featuring comedic elements and spectacular effects despite their serious subject matter. Blood sports were popular across all social classes. Bear baiting, bull baiting, and cockfighting drew large crowds. These activities, shockingly cruel by modern standards, were not seen as problematic in a world where animal suffering was commonplace and largely unremarked. Let's move now to perhaps the most fundamental aspect of medieval life: where and how people lived. Medieval housing prioritised basic shelter over comfort, particularly for the lower classes. A typical peasant dwelling was small, dark, and smoky, constructed from materials available locally: timber frames with walls of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure in many regions, or rough stone in others. These humble homes typically consisted of one room, perhaps 12 by 24 feet, housing an entire family along with their most valuable possessions, usually livestock during winter months. The floor was packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw that would be replaced when it became too filthy with food scraps and waste. Windows were minimal or non-existent, as glass was prohibitively expensive for common people. Any openings would be covered with wooden shutters, oiled parchment, or cloth, making interiors dark even during daylight hours. These coverings would be closed at night or during bad weather, leaving the interior pitch black except for firelight. The central feature was the hearth, an open fire in the middle of the room with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or seeping through the thatch. This inefficient arrangement meant that homes were constantly filled with smoke, contributing to respiratory diseases and eye problems. Proper chimneys were rare innovations before the late medieval period. Furniture was minimal and crude. Most peasants slept on straw-filled mattresses placed directly on the floor or on simple wooden platforms. Tables might be boards placed on trestles, easily dismantled when not in use. Seating consisted of benches, stools, or simply the floor. Storage was limited to chests, hooks on walls, or shelves, with most possessions in plain view. Urban housing presented different challenges. Towns were incredibly crowded, with buildings constructed close together and often extending over streets as upper stories projected outward. Extended family, servants, and apprentices might all share limited space, with multiple people to a bed. Fire was a constant danger in medieval towns, where wooden structures stood close together and firefighting technology was limited to bucket brigades. Major urban fires could destroy thousands of homes in a single event, leaving large populations homeless. For the wealthy, stone castles and manor houses provided more substantial shelter, though even these would seem uncomfortable by modern standards. Stone walls retained cold and damp, and heating large spaces with fireplaces was inefficient. Tapestries served not just as decoration, but as insulation against drafty walls. Privacy was limited even for nobility, with servants constantly present and family members often sharing sleeping chambers. And these varied dwellings were where medieval people spent approximately 1/3 of their lives sleeping or trying to. Sleep, that essential human function, looked very different in medieval times than our modern 8-hour consolidated pattern. Historical evidence suggests that medieval people commonly practiced biphasic or segmented sleep, sleeping in 2 distinct periods with a wakeful interval between them. The first sleep would begin shortly after dusk, as expensive candles and rushlights made staying up after dark impractical for most people. After several hours, people would wake around midnight and remain awake for an hour or more before returning to their second sleep until dawn. This wakeful period wasn't considered abnormal or problematic, but rather a natural part of the night when people might pray, reflect, visit neighbours, or even be intimate with spouses. Historical documents referred to this time as the watch or the waking hour, a normal expected break between first and second sleep. The sleeping environment itself would hardly promote restful slumber by our standards. Remember that mattress of straw or wool we mentioned earlier? It would be home to fleas, bedbugs, and mice, constant companions disturbing your sleep with their biting and movement. You wouldn't be sleeping alone either. Beds were expensive pieces of furniture, so sharing was the norm across all social classes. An entire family might share a single bed, sleeping head to foot to maximize space. Privacy was not a medieval concept when it came to sleeping arrangements. The sounds of the night would be different too. Without the white noise of air conditioning or the hum of electronics, you'd hear every creak of your dwelling, every rustle of animals in the straw, every cough or snore from family members. In towns, the night watchman would call out the hours, ringing bells or shouting to announce the time, and that all was well. Or to raise alarm if fire broke out, a constant urban danger. Temperature control was, well, non-existent. In winter, the fire might die down while you slept, leaving the room bitterly cold by morning. In summer, with multiple bodies packed together in small spaces, the heat could be suffocating. Sleeping naked wasn't an option, though. Most people wore their linen undergarments to bed, as sudden emergencies might require quick evacuation without time to dress. Dreams and nightmares held more significance in the medieval mind than they typically do today. Without scientific understanding of dream psychology, vivid dreams might be interpreted as divine messages, visitations from saints, or demonic temptations. Chronic nightmares could be attributed to sin or even witchcraft rather than psychological or physiological causes. And now, as dawn breaks on our medieval day, let's consider how people measured and understood time in this period, a concept very different from our minute-by-minute modern existence. Time measurement in the medieval period would seem hopelessly imprecise to us today. Today was primarily divided by the canonical hours, religious observances that structured monastic life, but gradually extended to the broader community. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime at 6 a.m, terce at 9 a.m, sext at noon, none at 3 p.m, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. For most people, especially in rural areas, nature provided the primary timepieces. Roosters announced dawn, shadows shortened toward noon, then lengthened again as evening approached. The position of the sun, the patterns of animal behaviour, and the changing quality of light marked the progression of hours far more reliably than any manufactured timepiece. Mechanical clocks began appearing in Europe around the 13th century, but these were massive installations in church towers or town belfries, not personal possessions. These early clocks were also notoriously inaccurate, often losing or gaining significant time each day and requiring frequent adjustment. Time itself was understood differently. Hours varied in length throughout the year, as daytime was divided into 12 equal parts, regardless of season. This meant that a summer hour of daylight might be significantly longer than a winter hour. Only with the spread of mechanical timekeeping did hours become standardized to the consistent 60-minute periods we know today. For peasants working the land, the concept of being on time barely existed. Work began at dawn and continued until dusk, with natural breaks determined by hunger, fatigue, or weather, rather than arbitrary time divisions. The rigid scheduling of labour by hours was largely a post-medieval development, arriving with industrialisation. Even for the educated and wealthy, precise time measurement remained elusive. Water clocks, candle clocks, and sand glasses provided approximate measurements for specific tasks, but weren't used for general timekeeping. The sundial, while more accurate on clear days, was useless at night or during cloudy weather. This more fluid relationship with time meant that medieval people experienced daily life at a pace we might find unrecognizable. Journeys were measured in days rather than hours. Cooking times were judged by appearance and experience rather than timers, and meetings happened when people arrived rather than at fixed hours. Speaking of journeys, let's consider how medieval people travelled, or more commonly, didn't. In our world of global tourism and daily commutes, it's difficult to imagine how limited and localised medieval life typically was. Many peasants might never travel more than 20 miles from their birthplace during their entire lifetime. The village where you were born would likely be where you lived, worked, married, raised children, and eventually died. This limited mobility wasn't just a matter of custom, but necessity and safety. Roads, where they existed at all, were poorly maintained dirt tracks that became impassable mudslicks during rainy periods. Roman roads, where they still survived, provided better surfaces but were deteriorating without systematic maintenance. Bridges over rivers were few and far between, often requiring lengthy detours or dangerous fording attempts. During spring thaws or heavy rains, entire regions could become effectively isolated when waterways swelled beyond crossable levels. The physical act of travel was exhausting. Walking was the most common form of transportation for common people. A good day's journey on foot might cover 15 to 20 miles in favourable conditions. Carrying goods or travelling with children would reduce this distance significantly. Those who could afford it might ride horseback or travel by cart, though medieval carts with wooden wheels on rough roads provided a bone-jarring experience that hardly qualified as comfortable. Suspension systems were primitive or non-existent, meaning travellers felt every rock, root and rut along the way. Water travel by boat offered more efficient transportation of goods and people where rivers, lakes or seas were available. However, medieval vessels were at the mercy of winds and currents, making journey times unpredictable. Seasickness, drowning and shipwrecks were constant hazards of water travel. Beyond the physical challenges, medieval travellers faced human threats at every turn. Banditry was common on isolated stretches of road where travellers might be robbed, assaulted, or killed with little chance of justice. The distinctions between soldiers, mercenaries, and outright bandits often blurred, particularly in regions experiencing or recovering from warfare. Even legitimate authorities could present dangers to travellers. Local lords might charge excessive tolls for crossing their lands or bridges. Different regions had varying laws and customs that could trap unwary travellers in legal difficulties. Speaking with an unfamiliar accent or dialect immediately marked you as an outsider, potentially subjecting you to suspicion or exploitation. Inns existed along major routes, but these were basic establishments, offering minimal comfort and security. Travellers commonly shared beds with strangers, risking exposure to disease and parasites with each night's accommodation. Food and drink at roadside establishments was often of poor quality and sometimes dangerously contaminated. For those who did undertake long journeys, merchants, pilgrims or messengers, preparation was extensive. Travellers would make wills before departing, recognising the very real possibility they might never return. Letters of protection or introduction from authorities might provide some security, but were no guarantee of safe passage. Pilgrimages represented the most common form of long-distance travel for ordinary people, providing religious merit that justified the risks and hardships involved. Popular destinations like Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem attracted thousands of pilgrims annually, creating established routes with services catering to travellers. Communication over distances was similarly challenging. In a world without telecommunications or reliable postal services, in an age of instant global communication, It's almost impossible to imagine the profound isolation that characterized medieval life. Information travelled only as fast as the messenger carrying it, and sending messages over any significant distance was expensive, slow, and uncertain. Letters were written primarily by professional scribes, as literacy was limited primarily to clergy and some nobles or merchants. The physical materials of writing, parchment, ink, and quills were expensive, making written communication a luxury rather than a casual occurrence. Once written, a letter needed a carrier. No standardized postal service existed for ordinary people. Messages might be entrusted to traveling merchants, pilgrims, or professional messengers employed by rulers or wealthy organizations. The reliability of these arrangements varied enormously, with many letters simply never reaching their intended recipients. Speed of delivery depended entirely on the mode of transportation available to the messenger. A letter carried by horseback might travel 20 to 30 miles per day under good conditions. In winter or during rainy seasons, this distance could be reduced to merely a few miles daily, or halt entirely when roads became impassable. Important news, the death of a king, the outbreak of war, or a papal decree might be communicated through a system of beacons or messengers, specially tasked with rapid delivery through relay systems. Even these expedited methods were painfully slow by modern standards, with news taking weeks or months to spread across Europe. For most people, news from the wider world came through travellers, merchants, pilgrims, or wandering entertainers who carried stories and information alongside their primary purpose. In this oral transmission, facts often became distorted, exaggerated or confused with each retelling, making medieval people's understanding of distant events highly unreliable. Within communities, communication happened through public announcements, often delivered after church services when the population was gathered, or called out by town criers in marketplaces. These announcements covered local regulations, tax collection dates, and judicial decisions affecting the community. Rumours and gossip served as important communication channels in close-knit villages and towns where privacy was minimal and community knowledge could mean survival. This social information network helped identify untrustworthy merchants, dangerous travellers, or opportunities for trade or marriage. The combination of geographic isolation and communication barriers meant that regional cultures, dialects, and customs developed strong distinctions. A person from northern France might struggle to understand the dialect spoken just 100 miles south, and cultural practices could vary dramatically between neighbouring valleys or provinces. This communication landscape meant that medieval people lived primarily in the immediate present of their local community, with limited awareness of events beyond their immediate vicinity. News that would dominate global headlines today might never reach an ordinary village at all, or arrive so delayed and distorted as to be unrecognisable. Now, let's turn our attention to a particular aspect of medieval life that has been heavily romanticised in modern media: the lives of children. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development, education, and play is largely a modern invention. In medieval times, children were essentially treated as small adults from a remarkably early age, with expectations, responsibilities, and hazards that would horrify contemporary parents. The first challenge was simply surviving infancy. Without understanding of germ theory, sterilisation, or modern paediatric care, infant mortality ranged from 30% to as high as 50% in some places and periods. Baptism typically occurred within days of birth, reflecting the urgency of ensuring spiritual salvation given the precarious nature of infant survival. Feeding practices contributed to these high mortality rates. While breastfeeding was common, particularly among poorer women who couldn't afford wet nurses, weaning often introduced dangerous substitutes. Infants might be fed grain gruel through unsanitary cloths or crude devices, introducing pathogens while providing minimal nutrition. Those who survived infancy faced continued threats from diseases that are now preventable through vaccination. Measles, smallpox, whooping cough, and numerous other infections regularly swept through communities, with children often suffering the highest mortality rates. By age 7, children were considered capable of productive work and began contributing to household or manor labour according to their strength and ability. Boys might assist with agricultural tasks, learn trades as apprentices, or tend livestock. Girls typically helped with domestic chores, textile production, food preparation and childcare. Education, in the formal sense, was available to a tiny minority. Most children learned through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. Basic religious education might be provided through the parish church, but literacy and numeracy remained rare skills outside urban centres or religious institutions. Play existed but was limited by time constraints and practical considerations. Children's games often mimicked adult activities. Mock battles for boys, household management for girls, serving as informal preparation for adult roles. Toys were simple and often homemade. Carved wooden figures, rag dolls, balls made from inflated animal bladders, or hoops driven with sticks. Discipline was harsh by modern standards. Corporal punishment was universally accepted as necessary for proper child development, endorsed by religious teachings and cultural norms. The concept of sparing the rod and spoiling the child was taken quite literally, with physical punishment seen as an expression of parental responsibility rather than abuse. Children were exposed to aspects of life that we now carefully shield them from. Death was visible and commonplace, with family members typically dying at home and bodies prepared for burial by the family. Execution of criminals was public, often drawing crowds that included children. Animal slaughter for food was a routine household activity witnessed from an early age. Childhood accidents were common and often deadly or permanently disabling. Burns from cooking fires, falls, animal attacks, drowning, and tool injuries occurred regularly, with little in the way of medical intervention available. A child who survived to adulthood might carry multiple scars and possibly disabilities from such incidents. For the children of nobility, life followed a different, but equally adult-oriented track. Noble boys might be sent to other households as pages as young as 7, beginning the path toward knighthood. Girls from wealthy families might be promised in marriage during childhood, with betrothals sometimes arranged in infancy. They might be sent to future in-laws' households or convents for raising, separated from their birth families at early ages. This accelerated progression to adulthood meant that medieval people experienced fewer years of dependent childhood, but potentially more years of responsibility, physical labour, and the stresses of survival. The modern concept of adolescence as a transitional period between childhood and adulthood simply didn't exist. Puberty marked the threshold to adult responsibilities, particularly for girls who might be married and bearing children by their early teens. And with this discussion of children, we should naturally turn to the structure that produced them: medieval marriage and family life. If you're picturing medieval marriage as a romantic affair where knights pledged devotion to fair maidens, well, that's largely the stuff of later literary invention. For most medieval people, marriage was primarily an economic and practical arrangement between families rather than individuals, with love considered a pleasant but unnecessary bonus if it developed after marriage. For peasants, marriage typically occurred when a couple could establish a viable household, meaning access to land, tools and resources sufficient for survival. This economic necessity often delayed marriage until the late teens or 20s, contrary to the common belief that all medieval people married extremely young. The consent of families was crucial, as marriage formed alliances between households and redistributed resources through dowries or marriage portions. Parents, particularly fathers, held significant authority over marriage choices, Though church doctrine technically required the consent of both partners, the actual process of getting married was less formal than we might imagine. While church weddings existed, many marriages began with mutual consent, declared before witnesses, followed by consummation. The church gradually asserted control over marriage throughout the medieval period, but village customs and practices often remained paramount for common people. Once married, the hierarchical nature of medieval society was reflected within the household. Men held legal authority over wives and children, with the right to administer moderate physical correction to both. Women were expected to be obedient to husbands, though historical records suggest the daily reality often involved more partnership and negotiation than the legal theory might indicate. For women, marriage typically meant frequent pregnancy. Without effective contraception, a married woman might experience 10 to 15 pregnancies during her fertile years, though many of these would end in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies aged women prematurely, contributing to earlier mortality compared to men. Divorce, as we understand it, didn't exist, though marriages could be annulled under specific circumstances such as close blood relationship or non-consummation. Abandonment occurred but left women in particularly vulnerable positions, as they had few legal rights, independent of husbands or fathers. Death frequently dissolved marriages, creating blended families when widows and widowers remarried. Children might be raised by step-parents, sent to live with extended family, or placed in service or apprenticeships if resources were stretched too thin after a parent's death. Extended family connections provided crucial support networks. Multiple generations might live together or in close proximity, sharing resources and labour. Elderly parents might rotate among adult children's households, contributing what work they could manage while receiving care as their abilities declined. Among nobility, marriage was even more explicitly strategic, forming alliances between powerful families or securing territorial claims. Children might be betrothed in infancy, with marriages sometimes taking place when the bride was 12, the canonical minimum age, and the groom 14, though consummation might be delayed until the bride was older. For those who didn't marry, whether by choice, circumstance, or family strategy, limited options existed. Religious life in monasteries or convents provided the most respectable alternative, particularly for women. Others might remain in family households as unmarried siblings, providing labour without establishing independent families. For those without family support, service in other households or marginal occupations offered precarious survival. From birth to marriage to death, religion provided the framework through which medieval people understood their world and their place in it. Let's examine this spiritual dimension more closely. For medieval people, the supernatural wasn't a matter of belief or disbelief, it was simply reality. The physical world they inhabited was interpenetrated at every point by spiritual forces, both divine and demonic, that influenced daily life in tangible ways. Heaven, hell, and purgatory weren't abstract concepts but concrete destinations awaiting every soul. The fear of eternal damnation was visceral and immediate, influencing decisions and behaviours in ways modern people might find difficult to comprehend. Salvation wasn't a private matter, but a community concern, with the spiritual welfare of individuals affecting the whole society. Saints weren't distant historical figures, but active, present intercessors who could be called upon for specific help. St. Christopher protected travellers, St. Margaret assisted women in childbirth, St. Anthony helped locate lost objects, and dozens of other specialised supernatural helpers stood ready to assist with life's challenges. For those who properly venerated them, relics, physical remains or possessions of saints, held tremendous power in the medieval imagination. The bones, hair, clothing, or personal items of holy figures were believed to channel divine power, capable of healing illnesses, protecting communities, or ensuring good harvests. Pilgrims travelled great distances to view and touch particularly famous relics, while churches competed to acquire these spiritual treasures. Angels and demons weren't metaphorical, but literal beings that might be encountered in daily life. Guardian angels protected individuals, while demons actively sought human souls through temptation or possession. Strange occurrences, illnesses, or unusual behaviour might be attributed to these supernatural entities rather than natural causes. Magic existed at the boundaries of acceptable practice, neither entirely condemned nor fully embraced. Charms, spells, and rituals blended Christian prayers with pre-Christian practices in ways that blurred modern distinctions between religion, superstition, and magic. Village healers might combine herbal knowledge with prayers or incantations, seeing no contradiction between natural remedies and supernatural assistance. The natural world itself was alive with meaning and portent. Unusual weather, animal behaviour, or astronomical events were interpreted as divine messages or warnings. Comets, eclipses, or blood-red moons signalled momentous changes or divine displeasure. Birth defects in humans or animals might indicate sin or demonic influence in a community. Dreams held prophetic significance, potentially containing messages from God, saints, or departed loved ones. Dream interpretation was taken seriously, with certain dreams requiring specific religious responses like pilgrimage or charitable donations to avert predicted disasters. Death was understood as a transition rather than an ending, with elaborate practices surrounding the proper passage of souls. The moment of death was ideally witnessed by family and community members who prayed for the departing soul. The physical body required specific preparation and ritual, while the soul needed prayers and masses to assist its journey through purgatory toward heaven. The division between natural and supernatural causation that seems clear to modern minds simply didn't exist for medieval people. A crop failure might simultaneously be attributed to poor soil management, unfavourable weather, divine punishment for community sin, and malicious witchcraft from a neighbour, with all these explanations coexisting rather than competing. This spiritual dimension added layers of meaning to medieval life that we've largely lost in our more materialistic understanding of reality. Every action had potential spiritual consequences, every misfortune possibly indicated divine displeasure, and every blessing manifested supernatural favour. This perspective provided both comfort and anxiety, explaining suffering while also suggesting it might have been deserved or preventable through greater piety. With spiritual reality so central to medieval understanding, let's examine how this manifested in the cycle of seasons and celebrations that structured the medieval year. While we organise our lives around work schedules, weekends and vacations, medieval people structured their year according to a complex calendar of religious observances, agricultural necessities, and seasonal changes. This temporal framework provided both practical guidance for survival tasks and spiritual meaning to the cycles of nature. The church calendar provided the primary structure, with the liturgical year beginning at Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, rather than January 1st. Major feasts like Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost served as anchoring points, with numerous saints' days, filling the spaces between these significant celebrations. Each day of the week held specific associations and restrictions. Fridays were days of abstinence from meat in remembrance of Christ's crucifixion. Sundays were theoretically days of rest, though agricultural necessities often trumped this ideal, particularly during harvest times when weather dictated work patterns, regardless of religious observance. Seasonal agricultural tasks provided another layer of temporal organisation. Ploughing, planting, harvesting, butchering, and preserving foods each had optimal times determined by natural cycles rather than arbitrary dates. Proverbs and folk wisdom helped communities remember when to perform critical tasks: sow oats in March, barley in April, wheat in May, or on St. Luke's Day, October 18th, the oxen go to the mire, signalling the end of ploughing season. The most joyous occasions in the medieval calendar were festivals that combined religious observance with community celebration. Christmas lasted for 12 days rather than a single day, with different observances and traditions for each day between December 25th and January 6th, Epiphany. This extended celebration included role reversals like the Feast of Fools, where social hierarchies were temporarily inverted for communal catharsis. Easter represented the most important religious feast, preceded by the 40 days of Lenten fasting and abstinence. After weeks of dietary restrictions and penitential practices, Easter brought renewed joy, special foods, and community celebrations recognizing both spiritual resurrection and the natural rebirth of spring. Carnival, or Shrovetide, just before Lent, provided a final opportunity for excess before weeks of restriction. These celebrations often featured masquerades, abundant food and drink, mock battles or contests, and temporary liberation from normal social constraints, allowing communities to release tensions before the disciplined period ahead. May Day celebrations welcomed spring with maypoles, dancing, and the selection of May queens and kings. These festivities incorporated pre-Christian fertility elements within a nominally Christian framework, demonstrating how older traditions persisted by adapting to new religious contexts. Midsummer, around June 24th for St. John's Day, featured bonfires believed to protect against evil spirits, while also practically reducing insect populations at their summer peak. Young people might leap through these flames for luck or purification, a practice church authorities often criticised but failed to eliminate. Harvest festivals in late summer and fall expressed gratitude for successful crops while acknowledging community interdependence. The Lord's harvest might be gathered first with communal labour, followed by individual peasant harvests, with celebrations marking the completion of this crucial annual task. All Hallows Eve, Halloween, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day, October 31st, November 2nd, recognise the thinning boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead. Special prayers for departed souls, festive meals incorporating symbols of mortality, and customs like soul cakes for the deceased demonstrated how death remained integrated with life, rather than separated from it. Interspersed throughout the year were local saints' days and patronal festivals specific to particular regions or communities. These occasions often featured processions, special masses, communal meals, games, and rare opportunities for leisure in lives otherwise dominated by labour. Fasting periods punctuated the year with regular rhythm, not just a major fast of Lent, but also Advent, Ember Days, quarterly 3-day fasts, and regular weekly abstinence. These practices both spiritualised the experience of periodic scarcity and helped conserve food supplies during critical times. This complex annual cycle provided medieval communities with shared experiences that reinforced social bonds, while addressing both practical needs and spiritual concerns. Festivals and celebrations offered rare moments of joy, abundance, and relaxation in lives characterized by scarcity, hardship, and unrelenting work. Which brings us to perhaps the most fundamental aspect of medieval existence: the endless, back-breaking labour required simply to survive. The modern concept of work-life balance would have been incomprehensible to medieval people, for whom labour wasn't a separate category of existence, but life itself. From earliest childhood until death or complete disability, physical work consumed most waking hours, varying only in intensity with seasons rather than ceasing entirely. For the vast majority engaged in agricultural labour, work patterns followed natural cycles. Spring brought the exhausting task of ploughing, guiding a wooden plough behind oxen or horses to break soil compacted over winter. Without modern ergonomic design, this meant hours of straining against the plough handles, navigating around rocks and roots in often muddy spring conditions. Sowing followed ploughing, with precious seeds scattered by hand in a careful balance. dense enough for good yield, but not so dense that plants would crowd each other. Too much or too little seed could mean the difference between survival and starvation months later. Summer brought its own labour-intensive tasks. Fields required constant weeding by hand to protect valuable crops. Hay needed cutting and drying at precisely the right time. Too early, and it wouldn't provide maximum nutrition. Too late, and a summer storm might destroy it completely. This timing created periods of intense work when entire communities laboured from dawn until dusk, snatching minimal sleep before beginning again. Harvest represented the most critical and demanding work period of the agricultural year. Grains were cut with hand sickles in a back-breaking posture, then bound into sheaves, transported to threshing areas, and processed by hand to separate valuable grain from chaff. A single day's delay could mean crop loss to sudden storms, birds, or rodents. During these peak labour periods, even pregnant women, the elderly, and children worked to their maximum capacity. Winter didn't bring rest, but rather a shift to indoor tasks: threshing remaining grain, repairing tools and equipment, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and processing preserved foods. The shortened daylight hours meant some reduction in work, but firelight enabled necessary tasks to continue after sunset. Women's labour deserves special mention for its relentless variety and lack of seasonality. Beyond helping with fieldwork during critical periods, women maintained continuous responsibility for food preparation, childcare, textile production, water collection, and household maintenance. While the men might have periods of slightly reduced labour between agricultural peaks, women's essential daily tasks never ceased. Specialised trades in towns presented different but equally demanding work patterns. Blacksmiths endured extreme heat, smoke, and the physical strain of hammering metal for hours. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals that damaged their lungs and skin while standing in noxious vats of decomposing matter. Weavers developed skeletal deformities from maintaining the same position for countless hours at looms. Hours were dictated by daylight rather than clocks, meaning summer work days might stretch to 16 hours or more, contracting to perhaps 8 hours during winter's shortest days. The concept of a weekend didn't exist, though Sunday theoretically provided rest for religious observance. Essential tasks like animal care couldn't be postponed. Childhood offered no protection from labour expectations. By age 7, children were contributing significantly to household work. By adolescence, they performed nearly adult workloads. The elderly worked until physically incapable, gradually reducing their contributions as strength failed rather than experiencing a defined retirement. This unrelenting physical labour exacted a severe toll on medieval bodies. Skeletal remains show evidence of arthritis, vertebral deformities and repetitive stress injuries beginning much earlier than in modern populations. Hernias, chronic joint pain, and premature physical deterioration were expected aspects of aging rather than exceptional conditions. Perhaps most alien to modern sensibilities was the absence of the concept of labour rights or fair compensation. Work wasn't something you sold by the hour with defined conditions and protections. It was an inherent obligation determined by your social position. Serfs worked their lord's lands not for wages, but because the hierarchical system demanded it as payment for protection and land use rights. The monotony was occasionally broken by communal work events that incorporated social elements. Barn raisings, harvests, or wool processing might bring communities together, combining necessary labour with rare opportunities for socialising, matchmaking, and reinforcing community bonds. This brings us naturally to the social bonds and community structures that made medieval survival possible, despite all the hardships we have explored. Community, essential for survival, the fierce individualism valued in many modern societies, would have been not just foreign, but actively dangerous in medieval Europe. Survival depended on complex networks of mutual obligation, collective labour and shared resources that bound people together in relationships that were simultaneously supportive and constraining. The village community formed the core social unit for most people. These weren't just collections of households that happened to be near each other, but intricate systems of collective management and mutual aid. The open field system of agriculture required coordinated planting, harvesting, and fallowing decisions made by village assemblies rather than individual farmers. Common resources, woodlands for gathering fuel, meadows for grazing livestock, streams for water, were collectively managed according to customary rights established over generations. These common systems prevented any individual from overexploiting shared resources, while ensuring all households had access to essentials beyond their private holdings. Labour exchanges represented another critical community function. Tasks requiring intense short-term labour, house building, well digging or harvesting, were often performed through collective work parties where households contributed workers to each other's projects. This system ensured necessary work was completed, while strengthening social bonds through shared effort and the meals that typically accompanied these events. Risk was distributed through community structures. If fire destroyed a family's home, neighbours would contribute labour and materials for rebuilding. If illness prevented a household from planting or harvesting, others would include their fields in communal work. These informal insurance systems provided essential safety nets in a world without government social programs or commercial insurance. Community surveillance and social control mechanisms maintained order with minimal formal law enforcement. Everyone knew everyone else's business in close-knit villages, a system that limited privacy but also provided security and ensured adherence to social norms. Reputation was a precious resource, carefully maintained through proper conduct and reciprocal relationships. Celebrations and rituals reinforced community bonds while providing rare opportunities for leisure. Weddings, religious feasts, harvest festivals, and other community gatherings combined practical functions, like negotiating marriages or resolving disputes, with much needed opportunities for joy in otherwise difficult lives. For women particularly, community relationships provided essential support through life's dangers. Childbirth was attended by experienced women from the community who provided both practical assistance and emotional support during this perilous event. Child rearing, too, was less isolated than in modern nuclear families, with children often supervised collectively as women worked together. Even death was a community affair rather than a private family matter. The preparation of bodies for burial, the wake or vigil before interment, and the funeral itself involved the entire community in supporting the bereaved while ensuring proper transition of the deceased to the afterlife. Mourning customs provided structured ways for communities to acknowledge loss while gradually reintegrating the bereaved into normal social functioning. These tight community bonds came with significant constraints on individual freedom and privacy. Conformity to community standards was enforced through gossip, ostracism, or in extreme cases, expulsion. Innovations or departures from traditional practices faced resistance, as unpredictable change could threaten the delicate balance of survival strategies refined over generations. We're nearing the end of our medieval day now, so let's consider what would likely claim your life in this harsh world if you somehow managed to survive beyond your first day. Ways to die. A medieval catalogue. The fragility of human life was an inescapable reality in the medieval world, with death an ever-present companion rather than a distant eventuality. The ways a medieval person might meet their end were numerous, varied, and often agonizingly slow by modern standards. Disease claimed a majority, with infections that modern medicine routinely cures proving regularly fatal. A simple cut or scrape could lead to sepsis and death within days. Internal infections from appendicitis, gallstones, or kidney stones offered excruciating endings with no surgical interventions available. Tuberculosis might slowly consume victims over years, while dysentery could kill within days through dehydration. Epidemic diseases periodically swept through communities with devastating effect. The Black Death could kill 60% of a town's population in a single outbreak. Smallpox left survivors scarred, but killed approximately 30% of those infected. Influenza, typhus, and myriad other infectious diseases regularly claimed lives, particularly among the very young and old. Childbirth represented a perilous passage for women, with maternal mortality estimated at 1 to 2% per birth. Given that a woman might experience 10 or more pregnancies during her fertile years, the cumulative lifetime risk was substantial. Perhaps 10 to 20% of women ultimately died from pregnancy-related causes. Complications like hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labour offered particularly painful ends, with minimal palliative care available. Malnutrition and famine regularly stalked medieval populations. Outright starvation claimed lives during crop failures, but chronic undernourishment more commonly weakened immune systems and stunted development, making people vulnerable to opportunistic infections. Winter months were particularly dangerous as food stores dwindled before spring growth began. Accidents claimed countless lives in a world without safety regulations or modern emergency medicine. Falls from heights during construction or maintenance, drownings while fording rivers or fishing, crushing injuries from animals or carts, and burns from cooking fires or house blazes regularly ended lives. Without antibiotics, sterile procedures, or wound management, even survivable injuries frequently prove fatal through subsequent infection. Violence, whether interpersonal or organised, provided another common exit from medieval life. Homicide rates in medieval communities dwarfed modern statistics, with estimates suggesting 10 to 100 times higher murder rates than contemporary Western societies. Disputes that might be resolved verbally today regularly escalated to lethal violence in a culture where personal honour required physical defence. Warfare claimed lives not just among combatants, but civilian populations as well. Medieval military campaigns typically involved chevauchée, deliberately destroying agricultural resources, burning villages. Warfare, not just for knights. Warfare claimed lives not just among combatants, but civilian populations as well. Medieval military campaigns typically involved chevauchée, deliberately destroying agricultural resources, burning villages, and terrorizing rural populations. The goal wasn't just defeating enemy armies, but making it impossible for regions to support resistance by destroying their economic base, which meant destroying the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people. Sieges created particularly horrific conditions for civilian populations caught within targeted towns or castles. As food supplies dwindled, people might resort to eating rats, leather, or even, in extreme cases, the dead. Disease spread rapidly in crowded conditions with deteriorating sanitation, often killing more defenders than actual combat. For those who survived the immediate violence of warfare, the aftermath brought continued dangers. Fields and orchards destroyed during campaigns meant famine in subsequent seasons. Wells contaminated deliberately or through battlefield decomposition spread waterborne diseases. Displaced populations faced exposure, starvation and violence as refugees in regions already struggling with limited resources. Even in peacetime, judicial violence regularly claimed lives through execution. Medieval justice emphasized public, often theatrical punishment, with hanging, beheading, burning, or more elaborate methods like drawing and quartering, serving both punitive and deterrent functions. Capital punishment applied to a far broader range of offences than in modern systems, including theft above certain values, poaching in royal forests, or repeated petty crimes. Age itself eventually claimed those who survived all other hazards, though old age, in medieval terms, rarely meant the extended decline familiar to modern experiences. Without management of chronic conditions or palliative care, the end typically came more swiftly once health began failing, often through pneumonia, stroke, or heart failure that went undiagnosed and untreated. The medieval approach to death differed fundamentally from modern attitudes. Death was neither medicalized nor hidden away, but integrated into community experience. The good death happened at home, surrounded by family and neighbours, with proper spiritual preparation through confession and last rites. Bodies remained in the home for viewing and vigil rather than being quickly removed to professional facilities. This intimacy with mortality shaped medieval psychology in ways difficult for modern minds to fully comprehend. Now, let's take a closer look at those who held power over the lives of ordinary medieval people, the nobility and their elaborate system of obligations and privileges. Lords and ladies, not quite fairy tales. If fairy tales and fantasy films have shaped your image of medieval nobility, well, prepare for some significant revisions. The reality of aristocratic life certainly included more privilege and comfort than peasant existence, but it wasn't the sanitized romantic world of popular imagination. Let's start with the castle itself, that iconic symbol of medieval power. Early medieval castles were primarily functional defensive structures rather than comfortable residences. Stone walls, excellent for repelling attackers, also made interiors cold, damp, and dark. Windows were minimal for defensive purposes, limiting natural light and ventilation. Smoke from heating and cooking fires permeated living spaces, contributing to respiratory problems among castle dwellers. Privacy was remarkably limited even for the elite. Noble households functioned with constant human presence. Servants, guards, officials visiting nobles, and various hangers-on created crowded, bustling environments where the lord and lady rarely experienced solitude. Even sleeping arrangements included attendants, with servants often sleeping at the foot of the lord's bed or on pallets in the same chamber. Hygiene presented challenges similar to those faced by commoners, though with somewhat better resources. Bathing remained infrequent by modern standards, though contrary to popular belief, medieval nobility did value cleanliness within the constraints of their technology. Perfumes, herbs, and regular changes of linen undergarments provided some compensation for limited bathing facilities. The diet of nobility differed from peasants more in quantity than fundamental variety until later medieval periods. Meat appeared more frequently on noble tables, a significant privilege, but preparation methods could render it barely recognizable to modern diners. Heavy spicing masked questionable freshness, while cooking techniques often involved boiling or heavy sauces rather than the grilled or roasted preparations we might expect. Sugar was an expensive luxury, used both in foods and as a display of wealth. Dental problems consequently plagued the nobility, with sugar-related tooth decay, adding to the general dental issues of the era. Toothaches, infections, and tooth loss affected nobles and peasants alike, though the wealthy might receive somewhat better care from barber surgeons or tooth drawers. Political violence represented a significant occupational hazard of nobility. Assassination, execution for real or invented treason, death in battle, or murder by ambitious relatives claimed many aristocratic lives. Political marriages often created complex webs of competing claims and interests, with deadly consequences when alliances shifted or opportunities arose. For noble women, arranged marriages created particular challenges. Often betrothed in childhood and married in early adolescence, noble girls might be sent to unfamiliar households in distant regions or even foreign countries, separated from familial support networks when most vulnerable. Their primary value lay in forging political alliances and producing heirs, with personal happiness or compatibility rarely considered relevant factors. Pregnancy and childbirth held dangers for noble women just as for peasants, though with somewhat better nutrition and care. The pressure to produce male heirs meant frequent pregnancies with minimal recovery time between confinements. A noble woman might continue bearing children into her late 30s or early 40s, with increasing risk with each subsequent birth. Noble children experience different, but not necessarily more nurturing childhoods than their peasant counterparts. Infants were typically handed to wet nurses rather than breastfed by their mothers, creating early separation from maternal care. By age 7, noble boys often left home entirely for fostering in other noble households or training as pages, beginning the long process toward knighthood. Girls might remain home longer, but receive training focused on household management, religious observance, and social skills necessary for their future roles as aristocratic wives. Education represented perhaps the greatest privilege of noble status, with literacy more common among the aristocracy than the general population. Noble boys typically received instruction from priests or specialized tutors, learning Latin, basic mathematics, religious texts, and history relevant to their future military and administrative responsibilities. Noble girls received more variable education, with literacy not considered essential for many aristocratic women, though religious instruction and household management training was standard. Leisure activities for nobility included hunting, a sport with practical value for developing military skills while providing high-status food. Tournaments offered both entertainment and military training, evolving from dangerous mock battles in early medieval periods to more regulated competitive events by later centuries. Chess, dice games, and various board games provided indoor entertainment, while music, poetry, particularly courtly love traditions, and dance offered more refined diversions. Despite these privileges, medieval nobles lived in a world of constant insecurity and competition. Royal favour could be granted and withdrawn capriciously, with dramatic consequences for individual fortunes. Military service remained an obligation of noble status throughout the period, with the attendant risks of death, injury, or capture and ransom in battle. Maintaining appropriate display and hospitality strained many noble budgets, creating cycles of debt and desperate measures to maintain appearances. The reality of noble life involved more violence, uncertainty, and physical discomfort than romantic portrayals suggest, while also imposing rigid obligations and expectations that limited individual freedom despite material privilege. The gap between noble and peasant experience was significant, but not the unbridgeable chasm sometimes imagined. All medieval people, regardless of status, lived in a world harsher, more dangerous, and more physically demanding than our own. Speaking of those physical demands, let's examine what medieval bodies endured and how they were understood and treated when they inevitably broke down. Health and medicine, pray you don't need it. If you've been paying attention to everything we've discussed so far, you won't be surprised to learn that medieval healthcare was primitive at best and actively harmful at worst. The fundamental understanding of human anatomy, disease processes, and effective treatments differed radically from modern medicine, creating approaches that ranged from occasionally effective to downright dangerous. The theoretical foundation of medieval medicine rested primarily on the ancient Greek concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health represented a proper balance of these substances, while illness resulted from imbalance. Treatments aimed to restore equilibrium through interventions like bloodletting, purging, or administering substances with opposing qualities to the presumed imbalance. This humoral theory led to treatments that often weakened already vulnerable patients. Bloodletting, Removing substantial quantities of blood through venesection, cutting veins, or applying leeches was a standard response to many conditions, from minor illnesses to serious infections. The resulting blood loss frequently compromised patients' immune responses and energy reserves when they most needed strength to fight disease. Diagnosis relied heavily on examination of bodily fluids and observable symptoms interpreted through humoral theory rather than understanding of underlying pathology. Urine received particular attention, with physicians examining its colour, clarity, smell, and even taste to determine humoral imbalances. Pulse taking provided another diagnostic tool, though interpretations often reflected theoretical preconceptions rather than accurate cardiovascular assessment. Surgical interventions occurred without anesthesia beyond alcohol, opium derivatives, or herbal preparations of limited effectiveness. Patients endured procedures fully conscious, often restrained by assistants. Without understanding of germ theory or sterilization, surgical sites frequently became infected, with suppuration, pus formation, actually considered a normal and necessary part of healing rather than a dangerous complication. The most educated medical practitioners, university-trained physicians, primarily served wealthy patients and approached medicine as a scholarly rather than practical discipline. Their expensive services emphasized complex theoretical assessments with limited physical examination, often prescribed elaborate compound medicines, and rarely involved hands-on treatment. Barber surgeons provided more practical medical care for ordinary people, combining hair cutting and shaving with surgical procedures, tooth extraction, bloodletting, and wound treatment. Their training came through apprenticeship rather than formal education, with practical skills passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and practice rather than theoretical instruction. Women served as essential healthcare providers despite formal exclusion from medical education. Midwives attended births and provided reproductive health care, while wise women or herb wives prepared remedies from local plants based on knowledge transmitted through generations. These female practitioners often combined practical effective treatments with religious or magical elements that made sense within medieval understanding of illness as potentially spiritual or supernatural in origin. Monastic infirmaries provided the closest equivalent to hospitals, caring for the ill and elderly within religious communities and sometimes extending care to local populations. These facilities emphasized spiritual care alongside physical treatments, with prayer considered as essential as, or more important than, material interventions. By the later medieval period, specialized hospitals began appearing in larger towns, though these functioned more as hospices or almshouses than modern medical facilities. Many focused on specific conditions. Leper hospitals isolated those with visible skin conditions. Pilgrim hospitals served those travelling to religious sites, while foundling hospitals received abandoned infants. Treatment remained basic, emphasizing basic care rather than cure for many chronic conditions. Epidemic diseases presented particular challenges for medieval medicine, with limited understanding of contagion mechanisms, despite recognition that some diseases spread between individuals. Public health measures during outbreaks typically included isolation of the sick, burning possessions, fumigation with herbs or smoke, and restrictions on movement between affected and unaffected areas, approaches that sometimes helped limit spread, despite incorrect theoretical understanding. Mental illness received various interpretations, ranging from demonic possession to humoral imbalance to moral failing, with treatments varying accordingly. Some mentally ill individuals found care within family settings or religious institutions, while others faced abandonment, imprisonment, or extreme interventions like trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, intended to release pressure or evil spirits. Chronic pain, a constant companion for many medieval people due to hard physical labour and untreated injuries, received management through herbal preparations with varying effectiveness. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid, related to modern aspirin, henbane, and opium derivatives provided some relief, though often with significant side effects or risks of dependency. Despite these limitations, medieval medicine wasn't entirely without merit. Herbal remedies sometimes contained genuinely effective compounds, later validated by modern pharmacology. Honey, for instance, was commonly applied to wounds, and does have antibacterial properties. Some surgical techniques for setting bones or treating certain injuries, developed through practical experience, proved reasonably effective even without theoretical understanding. The medical reality for most medieval people, however, meant suffering through illness with minimal effective intervention, relying primarily on the body's natural healing capacity supported by basic care, prayer, and herbal remedies of variable efficacy. Recovery or death depended largely on the condition, the individual's underlying health, and simple luck rather than medical intervention. Now let's turn our attention to something slightly more pleasant: what medieval people did for entertainment and leisure in their limited free time. Entertainment, simple pleasures. Life wasn't all work and hardship in the medieval world, though leisure certainly occupied a far smaller proportion of life than in modern society. Entertainment served crucial social and psychological functions, providing necessary relief from daily struggles while reinforcing community bonds and cultural values. For ordinary people, entertainment typically emerged from everyday activities rather than existing as a separate category of experience. Work songs rhythmically accompanied repetitive labour like threshing grain or spinning wool, transforming necessary tasks into opportunities for creativity and shared experience. Group work activities often incorporated competitive elements or concluded with communal celebrations that blended productivity with pleasure. Storytelling represented perhaps the most universal medieval entertainment, requiring no equipment or special venue while providing limitless content. Professional storytellers, minstrels, jongleurs, or bards travelled between communities performing memorised tales, songs and poems for food, shelter, or small payment. More commonly, ordinary community members shared legends, histories, folktales and family stories during evening gatherings or seasonal celebrations. Music permeated medieval life, from simple work songs to elaborate church compositions. Instruments varied by region and class, but commonly included pipes, drums, stringed instruments like lyres or early fiddles, and simple wind instruments fashioned from available materials. Dancing accompanied music at celebrations, with circle and line dances predominating, rather than the coupled dancing of later periods. Religious drama evolved from liturgical representations within churches to elaborate community productions by the later medieval period. Mystery plays depicting biblical stories, and morality plays presenting allegorical moral lessons provided both entertainment and religious instruction. These performances involved broad community participation, with various guilds or neighbourhoods taking responsibility for different scenes in larger productions. Physical competitions and games satisfied both entertainment needs and practical training for potential combat. Wrestling, archery contests, early forms of football, far more violent and less regulated than modern versions, and various throwing competitions developed physical skills while providing communal entertainment. Children's games often mimicked adult activities while developing necessary physical coordination and social skills. Board games provided indoor entertainment across social classes, though specific games varied by status. Chess gradually spread across Europe as an elite intellectual pursuit, while versions of backgammon, Nine Men's Morris, and various dice games enjoyed broader popularity. Gambling frequently accompanied these games despite regular condemnation by religious authorities. Animals provided entertainment through both performance and competition. Trained bears, monkeys, or dogs performed at fairs and markets. hunting with dogs represented high-status entertainment with practical benefits in terms of meat acquisition. Less formal animal sports included dog fighting, cockfighting, and various races or chasing games that required minimal equipment or preparation. Festivals punctuated the yearly cycle with concentrated periods of celebration and entertainment. May Day brought maypoles and selection of May Queens, celebrating spring fertility. Midsummer bonfires combined practical insect control with festivities marking the year's longest days. Harvest celebrations expressed gratitude for successful crops while providing rare opportunities for abundant food and drink before winter scarcity. The Christmas season, lasting the full 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany, featured particular celebration, with Lord of Misrule traditions temporarily inverting social hierarchies, allowing commoners to parody nobility and creating licensed periods of excess before returning to normal social order. These controlled inversions provided psychological release from rigid hierarchical structures, while ultimately reinforcing their legitimacy through temporary, bounded transgression. Public punishment ironically served as entertainment as well as judicial function, with executions and lesser punishments drawing crowds who participated through jeering, throwing refuse at criminals, or simply enjoying the spectacle. This participation reinforced community standards while providing dramatic entertainment in lives otherwise limited in theatrical experiences. Alcohol played a central role in medieval entertainment, with beer or ale consumed daily by all ages as safer than water, and providing significant calories alongside intoxication. Special brews marked celebrations, with stronger varieties reserved for festivals, when behavioural standards relaxed somewhat. Wine remained primarily an elite beverage in most regions, though available to broader populations in wine-producing areas. Even within these entertainments, the hierarchical nature of medieval society remained evident. Nobility enjoyed exclusive hunting rights in many regions, with harsh penalties for commoners poaching game from royal or noble forests. Elite entertainment increasingly differentiated from common amusements as the medieval period progressed, with courtly literature, music, and dance developing specialized forms accessible primarily to the educated upper classes. Despite these class distinctions, entertainment served similar psychological functions across social categories, providing temporary escape from hardship, strengthening social bonds through shared experience, transmitting cultural values across generations, and creating spaces for controlled release of tensions inevitable in hierarchical societies with limited resources. Let's now look at an aspect of medieval life that varied enormously by social status: what people actually wore on their bodies day to day. Clothing, status, function, and discomfort. Medieval clothing combined practical function with clear signals of social status, occupation, and regional identity. Unlike our world of fast fashion and rapidly changing styles, medieval clothing evolved slowly, with basic forms remaining consistent for decades or even centuries, while materials and details indicated where you belonged in the social hierarchy. For peasants and labourers, clothing prioritised durability and function over fashion or comfort. Coarse wool and linen formed the staple fabrics, both produced locally through household industry. Colours remained largely muted natural shades: browns, greys, off-whites, and dull greens derived from inexpensive local dyestuffs. The cloth itself had a rough texture that modern skin would find constantly irritating. Men's basic attire consisted of linen undergarments, if they could afford them, covered by wool tunics reaching to mid-thigh or knee, belted at the waist, and paired with fitted hose or loose trousers depending on the period and region. Outer garments for cold weather included simple cloaks or hoods, often without the fitted sleeves or structured shoulders familiar to modern clothing. Women wore linen shifts beneath wool or linen gowns, generally floor length with varying sleeve designs across the period. Head coverings were nearly universal for adult women, ranging from simple linen veils to more elaborate arrangements for special occasions or higher social status. Like men's clothing, women's everyday garments prioritised function and modesty over decoration or fashion. Children wore simplified versions of adult clothing rather than specialised garments designed for growth or play. Once out of swaddling clothes as infants, children dressed essentially as miniature adults, with their clothing indicating the social status of their families rather than their age or activities. Footwear presented particular challenges in a world before rubber soles or waterproofing technologies. Leather shoes provided minimal protection, wearing out quickly with regular use, and offering little barrier against cold or moisture. Wooden pattens or clogs might be worn over shoes in muddy conditions, while many peasants went barefoot during warmer months to preserve precious shoes for winter use or special occasions. Laundering clothes created significant labour, particularly for linen undergarments requiring regular cleaning. Outer wool garments received less frequent washing due to the difficulty of drying heavy wool and the risk of shrinkage or felting with repeated washing. Instead, brushing, airing, and spot cleaning extended wear between infrequent full laundering, contributing to the pervasive body odours we've discussed earlier. As we move up the social scale, clothing became increasingly elaborate and restrictive. Urban merchants and craftspeople displayed their prosperity through better quality fabrics, more complicated construction, and modest decorative elements. Trade guilds often specified appropriate dress for their members, distinguishing different crafts while ensuring no one dressed above their station. For nobility, clothing served as essential visual display of status and wealth. Silk, velvet, fine wool, and other imported fabrics in vibrant colours, achieved through expensive dyestuffs like scarlet kermes, insect-derived red dye, or Tyrian purple, derived from thousands of specific sea snails, immediately signalled elite status. Fur linings or trimmings, particularly minever, white stomach fur of red squirrels, or sable, added both warmth and conspicuous display of wealth. By the later medieval period, elite fashion developed extremes that prioritised status display over comfort or function. Men's hose became increasingly tight, requiring precise tailoring and regular adjustment. Women's headdresses grew to fantastical proportions, with horn-like structures or soaring steeple shapes requiring complex internal supports and limiting movement. Such impractical garments visually communicated the wearer's freedom from manual labour, while restricting physical activity in ways that reinforced gendered behavioural expectations. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate clothing across social categories, explicitly prohibiting certain fabrics, colours, or styles to those below specific social ranks. These regulations, though frequently evaded, aimed to maintain visible social distinctions and prevent social climbers from visually mimicking their betters through dress. The very existence of such laws indicates the importance of clothing as status marker and the anxiety created when these visual codes became blurred. Specialized occupational clothing developed for certain trades with particular requirements. Blacksmiths wore leather aprons protecting against sparks and hot metal. Tanners developed distinctive garb resistant to the caustic substances used in leather preparation. Religious orders adopted specific habits, distinguishing different monastic communities while emphasizing rejection of worldly fashion and display. Seasonal adaptation occurred through layering rather than completely different wardrobes for summer and winter. The same basic garments might be worn year-round, with additional layers, heavier materials, or fur linings added for cold weather. This approach reflected both the expense of clothing and the reality of gradual seasonal transitions rather than abrupt temperature changes. Unlike modern consumers who might own dozens or hundreds of garments, medieval people, even among the wealthy, possessed far fewer items of clothing. A peasant might own just one or two changes of clothes, carefully maintained and repaired over years of use. Even nobility might have their elaborate garments repeatedly remade and updated rather than constantly acquiring new pieces. The intimate relationship between people and their limited wardrobes created different attitudes toward clothing than our disposable fashion culture. Garments represented significant investment of resources and labour, whether home produced or purchased. Clothing often appeared in wills and testaments as valuable bequests, passed down through generations or given to servants as significant gifts. Undergarments, as we conceive them, were limited or non-existent for many people, particularly among lower classes. The linen shirt or shift served as primary undergarment, absorbing body oils and sweat to protect more difficult to clean outer garments. Specialised undergarments supporting or shaping the body, like later corsets or structured garments, existed in simpler forms among the elite, but weren't universal across social classes. The social communication function of medieval clothing meant that changing clothes involved changing identity in ways more profound than modern fashion choices. Disguise through inappropriate dress could constitute serious transgression or even criminal deception. Cross-dressing was treated as particularly serious deviation, with historical cases of women wearing men's clothing to access male opportunities or protection, often resulting in severe punishment when discovered. This rigidity of dress codes reinforced the generally rigid social structure we've been exploring throughout our medieval day. Now, as our journey through this world comes to a close, let's reflect on perhaps the most fundamental difference between medieval and modern experience: the medieval mindset itself. The medieval mind, a different reality. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of truly understanding medieval life isn't the material differences we've explored, though those are substantial, but the profoundly different ways medieval people conceptualized and experienced their world. Their mental landscape operated with assumptions, priorities, and frameworks so different from our own that even when we use the same words, we often mean entirely different things. Let's begin with time consciousness. Medieval experience of time flowed primarily from natural and religious rhythms, rather than mechanical measurement. Days expanded and contracted with seasonal daylight. Years were marked by cycles of agricultural activity and religious observances, rather than numerical progression. The past existed as a flattened realm where events from centuries before might seem equally distant, rather than placed in linear chronological progression. Historical consciousness differed fundamentally from modern understanding. Without our conceptual framework of historical periods, progress, or evolution of societies, medieval people viewed the past as essentially similar to the present in basic human experience. Biblical figures or ancient Romans were imagined in medieval dress and settings, not understood as products of distinctly different cultures or eras. The concept of anachronism barely existed because the past wasn't conceptualized as fundamentally different from the present. Identity derived primarily from community position rather than individual characteristics or achievements. When medieval people thought about who they were, they understood themselves first through relational categories. John the Miller's son, Mary from Northfield, a member of the Blacksmiths' Guild, a resident of York. The modern emphasis on individual personality, preferences, or unique talents as the core of identity would have seemed strange, or even dangerous in emphasizing personal attributes over community placement. Causality operated differently in medieval understanding, with multiple explanatory frameworks coexisting rather than competing. A crop failure might simultaneously result from poor agricultural techniques, unfavourable weather, divine punishment for community sin, and malicious witchcraft. With all these causes accepted without the contradiction a modern mind would perceive, natural and supernatural causation intertwined rather than occupying separate categories of explanation. The boundary between visible and invisible realms remained permeable in medieval consciousness. Angels, demons, saints, and other spiritual entities were understood as literally present and active in daily life, rather than metaphorical or symbolic. Dreams might contain actual visitations from supernatural beings, rather than psychological phenomena. The natural world brimmed with signs and symbols, where physical characteristics of plants, animals, or landscape features revealed their spiritual purposes and meanings. Authority and knowledge operated through fundamentally different mechanisms than in our information-saturated world. Tradition and received wisdom carried greater weight than innovation or discovery. The antiquity of an idea often constituted its primary validation, rather than experimental verification or practical results. Knowledge passed down from ancient authorities like Aristotle or Galen held greater credibility than direct observation that contradicted these sources. The relationship between humans and the natural world bore little resemblance to either modern exploitation or environmental conservation frameworks. Medieval people viewed nature simultaneously as God's creation, deserving respect, as potentially hostile force, requiring vigilance, and as resource provided for human use. These seemingly contradictory perspectives coexisted without the categorical divisions modern thinking imposes. Childhood was conceptualized not as a protected developmental period, but as an imperfect, incomplete version of adulthood. Children were understood as miniature adults, lacking full physical strength and reason, rather than beings with qualitatively different needs, capacities, or ways of thinking. This perspective informed the expectation that children would assume adult responsibilities as soon as physically capable, rather than experiencing extended education or play. The individual body was understood less as private, bounded territory than as permeable entity affected by countless external forces. Stellar configurations at birth shaped personality and health throughout life. Environmental factors like miasmas or night air directly penetrated bodily boundaries. The balance of internal humours responded to cosmic and seasonal shifts. This understanding created a less individualized, more environmentally embedded experience of physical existence than modern conceptions. Pain and suffering held different meaning in medieval consciousness, often interpreted as a valuable opportunity for spiritual growth or participation in Christ's suffering, rather than meaningless biological phenomena to be eliminated. This perspective didn't eliminate the desire to avoid suffering, but provided interpretive frameworks that potentially transformed its significance and experienced intensity. Medieval people weren't less intelligent than modern humans, but their intelligence operated within radically different frameworks of meaning, causality, and purpose. Their worldview maintained internal coherence and explanatory power for the experiences and challenges they faced, just as our worldview organizes our understanding of reality according to currently accepted frameworks. The true foreignness of medieval consciousness reminds us that human experience isn't universal across time and culture, but profoundly shaped by conceptual frameworks that can shift dramatically across centuries. Perhaps this mental world, more than the material conditions we've explored, represents the greatest barrier to our truly understanding what it would mean to live a medieval life. The end of your medieval day. As night falls once again on our imagined medieval existence, we've completed our journey through this distant world, one that shaped our present in countless ways, yet remains profoundly foreign to modern experience. We've explored the harsh physical realities of medieval life, the dirt, disease, discomfort, and constant labour that characterise daily existence for most people. We've examined the social structures and community bonds that made survival possible despite these challenging conditions. We've considered how medieval people understood their world and their place within it through frameworks of meaning very different from our own. If you actually lived in medieval Europe, rather than just visiting through this extended thought experiment, well, your chances of surviving beyond childhood would be statistically poor. If you did reach adulthood, your body would likely bear the marks of malnutrition, disease, and punishing physical labour. Your world would be geographically small, but conceptually rich, with meanings, associations, and spiritual significance largely invisible to modern perception. Would you be happy? That's perhaps the most difficult question to answer across the centuries that separate us from medieval experience. Medieval people certainly experienced joy, pleasure, and satisfaction, despite conditions we would find intolerable. Their expectations, formed within their historical context rather than by comparison to an unknown future, allowed for contentment we might find difficult to imagine given their material circumstances. The medieval world contained a full range of human emotion, aspiration, and experience, expressed through frameworks specific to their time and place. People loved, laughed, created beauty, sought meaning, and built communities that sustained them through hardships we can barely comprehend. From our position of material privilege and technological advancement. Perhaps the most valuable insight we can gain from this journey into the medieval past is perspective on our own historical moment. The distance between medieval and modern experience reminds us that human societies can organise reality in radically different ways, finding meaning and purpose through frameworks that may eventually become as foreign to future humans as medieval consciousness is to us. As you drift towards sleep, wrapped in clean bedding, in a temperature-controlled environment, with medical care available if needed, and a full stomach of safely preserved food, remember that everything we take for granted as normal would seem like miraculous luxury to even the wealthiest medieval noble. The ordinary comforts of modern life represent extraordinary privilege from the perspective of most humans who have ever lived, and perhaps in that realization lies the most important lesson of our medieval journey. Not just appreciation for modern comforts, but awareness of how profoundly our experience of being human is shaped by historical context, material conditions, and conceptual frameworks that we rarely examine because they constitute the water in which we swim. Sweet dreams from a world away, a world that helped create our present, but exists now only in the stones of surviving buildings, the pages of manuscripts, the artifacts in museums, and the historical imagination that allows us these brief journeys across centuries. Sleep well, in your decidedly non-medieval comfort.